Well, thank you very much. Now, because it's a new subject, I'm just warning you in advance, I'm going to move fairly quickly. Whenever I've given this talk, people often come up and they're writing questions down that get raised and they say, oh, but it was okay, by the end you answered them all. So here we go. But why do we want to look at a subject like this? Well, it's interesting, in about the last 40 to 50 years, there has been a massive increase in UFO sightings and supposed interaction with extraterrestrial visitors. What do I mean by that? Well, people actually believe that aliens are coming to abduct them in the middle of the night and take them up to their spaceships and all sorts of weird, freaky stuff that usually invokes howls of laughter to Christian audiences. But as you'll hopefully see, there's a little bit more to it, a bit more complex than that. Because when people find out I'm talking on this subject or I'm researching it, first question they say is to me, what is a UFO? So actually, I'll ask you the question, what is a UFO? An unidentified flying object, that's all it is. But you see, our culture has changed because you can ask a 5-year-old child or somebody who's now growing up in a science fiction culture, what is a UFO? And they'll say, a spaceship with people in it from a foreign planet or something like that, because that's what the common vernacular means. In fact, it was interesting, Don Batten was doing some ministry up the New South Wales coast here last year, and a survey came back from the high school chaplain, and he said that 80% of the children, in the results in the survey, 80% of the children surveyed believed that there was a God or a force behind the universe. And over 60% of those children believed that aliens created life on Earth. That should shock you, because they're not getting taught that in the classroom, are they? So there must be somewhere else where they're developing that idea. And also I find that even Christians, non-Christians, skeptics, right across the spectrum, all like to broad brush an answer. In fact, most of you say, well, I think it's all demonic or it's all psychological or something like that. But as I found out, there's actually quite a series of explanations that you can find when looking at this. But my point there is that everybody's made their mind up, even Christians, before they've really looked at the evidence and what's happening. Well, lots of people claim to see a UFO. This was ex-President Jimmy Carter, but before he was president, during his presidential campaign, he made this quote, "It was the darndest thing I'd ever seen. It was big, it changed colours, it was about the size of the moon. We watched it for 10 minutes, but none of us could figure out what it was. One thing's for sure, I'll never make fun of people who say they've seen an unidentified flying objects in the sky." He goes on, "If I become president, I'll make every piece of this information this country has about UFO sightings available to the public and the scientists. I am convinced that UFOs exist because I've seen one." Jimmy Carter actually claims to be a born-again Christian. And I might add, how much information did he uncover when he became president? What do you think? Wasn't a great deal. And sadly, in this subject, the truth is very hard to get to, because even when the obvious answer is that he didn't release any information, didn't find anything, that only adds to the conspiracy theory, you see, that he was covering it up, or he got silenced even when he became president or something like that. Now, a Gallup poll, these Gallup polls are run recently concerning a subject of alien life or extraterrestrial life. In 1998, a Gallup poll extrapolated that over 20 million Americans had claimed to see a UFO. Over 4 million Americans claimed to have been abducted by aliens, which estimates 3%, equates to 3% of the population worldwide, about 180 million people. And worldwide, there are about 150 sightings every single day. Now, I heard the ripples of laughter, which is quite normal when you mention the bit about abductions. But let me say something here. In this case, it's not only in America, okay? Because all over the world, people are having these same experiences. And even though the skeptics debunk them, one of the most obvious conclusions we can get that something seriously is happening are the messages that are supposedly being received by these extraterrestrial visitors. And you will find that it's no surprise that most of their messages seem to be centered around the Bible. And it's quite a fascinating subject. What I'm saying is, a bus driver in Bombay claims he's been visited in the middle of the night, and you might have a lawyer working in Lancaster in America, and he received exactly the same message or something very, very similar, and you can't all put that down to psychological delusions or the same science fiction shows, okay? So let's investigate a bit more. The modern UFO phenomenon, if you want to call it that, The most famous occurrence probably in 1947. Businessman Kenneth Arnold was flying his light plane over Mount Rainier. He said he saw 9 saucer-shaped discs, and that's where the term flying saucer actually came from. He described them as saucers, as if they were skipping across the water. So that's where the expression flying saucer came from. 1947 was an important year in ufology. Now remember that term, I'll use it, UFOlogy, okay? It's a serious science. And 1947 was the year of, anybody else know? I'll find out how many space nerds we've got out here. Anybody want to know what happened in 1947? Something to do with extraterrestrials, I might point out. Roswell, there you go. So you want to know about dinosaurs, ask a 10-year-old. Want to know anything about space, ask those people who stay up at 11 o'clock at night watching episodes and reruns of Star Trek, okay? That's right, the Roswell incident as it became known. And I predict that this year you're actually going to get bombarded with a new TV series from Steven Spielberg, who marries the Roswell incident with abductions. And recently it was the highest rating show in history for the particular sci-fi channel that it appeared on in the United States. People are fascinated with the subject of UFOs. The same year that this sighting appeared, within a couple of days in the paper, flying saucers over Mount Rainier, in the same year, 1947, there were 850 sightings. In that same year, there was an explosion. One of the reasons for the explosions is people suddenly started looking in the sky. I might see one. So there is obviously a normal phenomenon that happens because people become aware that there might be something going on. But we need to look at 4 questions really to answer this. And as you'll see, it's really connected to this creation-evolution issue. The first one we're going to look at, because if life evolved on this earth, and haven't you heard this before? Because I've had this debate with people. If life evolved on the earth, it must have evolved, or must have happened elsewhere in this enormous universe. Science fiction, if anything, has given us the ability to sort of comprehend, if we can, the enormous size of the universe. You know, there's Captain Kirk travelling at warp 9, okay? And he travels millions of light years across the galaxy or something like that. See, we're just this tiny little speck in the universe, and you're saying, you Christians are so arrogant. You think that the earth is the only place where life could have evolved. Maybe you've heard arguments like that. The second one we need to look at is that conditions must be just right on other planets, because if aliens are entering our atmosphere, they've got to be able to live and breathe our air, so their conditions would have to be fairly similar. So we need to search for other planets that are the same. Aliens must be able to travel those vast distances in space, as you heard Dr. Hartnett say, light years away to the nearest stars, for example. And the last one is that these UFO sightings that we see, unidentified flying objects, well, they actually must be spacecraft that contain real extraterrestrial visitors. So we're going to have a look at those. Now, incidentally, in the 1940s, when they conducted Gallup polls, they had sections on UFOs. What is a UFO? And it was usually categorized as secret American technology or secret technology from another country or something like that. There was never a category that said it was, races from another planet. But by the 1950s, there was. And you can almost find on a graph that the amount of people that now believe that there is life elsewhere in the universe has increased by about 10% per decade. And what's happening is our culture is changing as a result of 2 things. Evolution, particularly cosmic evolution, if you want to call it that, and science fiction. In fact, the Gallup polls in the recent years show that in most Western countries, between 70 to 80% of the general population believe that there is extraterrestrial life somewhere out there. So the first one we're going to have a look at, okay, if life evolved on the Earth, it must have happened elsewhere. Well, this is just not a small belief. NASA, the world's premier space agency, also believe that life must be out there. This is Dan Golden, the senior administrator, and he said the 4th goal is to search for Earth-like planets that may be habitable or inhabited. Have a look, may be habitable or inhabited. This is part of a program called the Origins program that NASA are running. After the Apollo moon missions, I think America's finest hour, the Apollo missions were actually supposed to go up into the 20s. But Apollo 17 was the last one. It was scrapped. People said, well, there's nothing there. It became mundane. And then they went to a reusable vehicle like the space shuttle, and NASA really lost its way, it lost its meaning, because it's very much driven by public funding, isn't it? And so this man very, very cleverly, and I think genuinely, started the Origins program, which is really a search of the heavens for extraterrestrial life. And what they also want to find out is how life started. So really that's a religious question. How did it all begin? You can look on their website, the Origins website, and it asks two fundamental questions. Where do we come from, and are we alone? Now you heard Taz talk a little bit about the sort of the definitions, if you like, or the idea that there's a couple of types of science, and this is really central. We need to do this again, because there's experimental science. That's the sort of stuff like, or technology building upon itself. You can have a look at the DNA and marvel at the complexity. You can build rocket machines, send men to the moon, etc. Or historical science, which are really about events that occurred in the past that you or I were not there to witness. So we were not there to see them, so we have to make up stories about the past. We only have the evidence in the present. Big Bang, for example, is historical science. We weren't there to witness. We're interpreting the evidence today to fit in with the Big Bang or creation, depending on your bias. Operational or experimental science happens in the present. You can repeat the experiments, it's observable. Evolution, and let's just think about cosmic evolution, if you like, at this point, happened in the past, once off, no one's ever seen it happen. But the Big Bang is central to the idea that there is extraterrestrial life. And this is probably the best way I can explain it. I was at a UFO conference in Brisbane, the third annual UFO convention, okay? Brisbane has the oldest UFO group in the world, we found out. And a New South Wales UFO investigator got up and he spoke about the Big Bang and cosmological evolution. And he made a statement like this: well, the great science experiment, evolution, we know works. Here we are proof. Therefore, if the Big Bang is correct and we are in a young part of the universe, there must be other parts of the universe that are 1 billion years older, and therefore those races out there must be 1 billion years advanced in their technology. So who are we to say by our standards that they could not develop craft to reach here? Can you see how it fits? And that's the idea. That's why we always have this idea of, ETs being advanced with their technology, etc. But I was talking to John Hartnett the other day and I said, how many models are there of the Big Bang? And he says, quite a few. Well, here's one for you. This was in the American Spectator magazine. It says, from historic Newbury, Michigan, comes more evidence of the Big Bang theory of creation. On July 12, an abandoned ranger headquarters at Tarcomin and Falls State Park blew sky high, sending debris 100 feet into the atmosphere and alarming campers 14 miles away. The explosion's now been traced to bat manure that for decades had been generating methane gas, and until in mid-July it became highly volatile, and kaboom, there's more. Scientists believe that a similar cataclysm 8 million years ago gave us the beginnings of the universe, though even those early scientists cannot account for those early bats, and for those of a religious disposition, a world created by bat dung is too depressing to contemplate. But there is a search going on, another serious search, and I'm sure most of you have heard of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. This was funded with billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. It lost favour, they didn't find anything. And recently, NASA have resumed funding. And a congressman in America said, well, it should match public interest. So therefore, NASA have been really forced to resume funding, plus they're jumping and piggybacking on the SETI idea because it is so popular. People like Steven Spielberg, Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, have all invested millions of dollars into the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And you can actually log on as a home user. There are millions of PC users around the world analysing all the data that's received via SETI. But under Project Phoenix, part of the SETI program, they've been spending billions of dollars, okay? They have millions of participants worldwide. It's been scanning 28 million radio frequencies a second for 40 years. And how many messages do you think they've received? Not one. Think about that, 28 million radio frequencies every second for 40 years, but never one intelligent coded message, because that's what they need. To recognize intelligence, the message would have to be coded. You'd have to see ordered sequences of letters or some language to understand that it came from an intelligent source. Actually, they did receive one message from space they got excited about. Originally, it was called LGM-1. And what do you think LGM-1 stands for? Little green men. It's true. But it was found to be a pulsar, and what a pulsar is, it's a collapsed star. And for example, you know, a teaspoon of this stuff would probably weigh, you know, 1 billion tons or something like that. But it's called a pulsar because it rapidly rotates and it pulses. It gives off a radio signal, and that's really what they found. But a significant point here, folks, you know, with NASA and SETI, they're spending billions of dollars. So for all you conspiracy theorists out there, if they've already acknowledged extraterrestrial life and it's hidden in Area 51 somewhere, why are they spending the money? Not only that, if there's 150 sightings average visiting us every day, or aliens visiting us every day in their spaceships, why do we not see them on radar entering the atmosphere? Never once. We do see UFOs on radar, by the way, and although most of them can be explained by natural phenomenon, many of them have disappeared off radar. American fighter jets, for example, have gone up, sighted them, fired at them, they've disappeared, they've merged together, they've morphed, they've changed shape. You'll get some idea of where we're heading with that sort of information. So think about this coded information that SETI needs to have to recognize extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, you can see the heading there, the most complex information storage mechanism in the universe. What do you think I'm going to show you? DNA. The DNA molecule. Extremely complex in terms of the information that you can store on there. Because many people have the idea, people like von Daniken, you might remember, very, very popular. He said, you know, the sons of God in Genesis 6 were actually extraterrestrials that visited the earth and mated with humans and directed evolution, etc., or something like that. But if you want signs of intelligence, you shouldn't be looking out there, you should be looking here. How much information do you think, and some of you have been to our conferences, you'd know, could you store on a pinhead of DNA? If I could type out all the information into books, per se, and I was to make a pile of books, how high, how much information, how high would the pile be of books for all that information? Now, I've been around and people say, oh, 1 metre high, 2 metres high as the ceiling or whatever. Well, you know, you could amass a pile of books 240 times to the moon and back in just a pinhead of DNA. And SETI are looking for complex coded information, intelligence out there, when they really should be swapping their telescopes for microscopes, because an infinite intelligence has already streamed millions of encyclopedias worth of information to the Earth. Would you agree? It's just amazing when we consider how much there is. Now, last year was the 50th anniversary of the discovery of DNA. And in the last issue of Creation magazine, I wrote this article about James Watson and Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winners for the discovery of DNA. Now, Crick was an ardent atheist, in fact, anti-Christian. He said one of the reasons he went into the sciences was to disprove the notion of a biblical creator. And in a book called Life Itself, he wrote when he discovered the complexity of DNA, he said it was almost like a miracle. He recognized intelligent design, but who did he attribute it to? This will shock you. He says the aliens did it. Sir Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner, believes that aliens seeded life on Earth about 8 billion years ago, according to his book. Well, the biogenetic law says that all life comes from life. Here's a human zygote, early stages of cell division. You know, I could ask you, can you give me any example of any life that you know of that spontaneously arises by itself? Any creature, any plant, any animal, anything you like, any insect. And you can't, because all life comes from life. And in fact, when we're talking about DNA, so minute, I love to think of that famous scripture in Romans 1:20, for the invisible things from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. Now, science fiction has a big part to play. Now, I'm not ticking anybody off for watching science fiction, because you might think, oh, well, it's anti-godly, it's not godly, or it's anti-God, and I believe it is. But what would be the difference in some respects to, say, watching a David Attenborough show that espouses evolution anyway? If you have your biblical glasses on and you interpret the evidence correctly, you might still get some entertainment value out of it. I mean, it is fantasy, but you might want to chew my ear off about that later. But the father of modern science fiction was Herbert George Wells. He was an anti-Christian. Listen to his quote. He said, "If all the animals and man had been evolved in this ascendant manner, there had been no first parents, no Eden, no fall." He goes on, "And if there had been no fall, then the entire historical fabric of Christianity, the story of the first sin and the reason for an atonement upon which the current teaching-based Christian emotion and morality collapsed like a house of cards." In short, he's saying no creation, no fall, no need for salvation. Because I can ask you, do you know of any science fiction that you know of that is glorifying to God? Because if you watch Star Wars, Star Trek, anything like that, it's all based on evolution, races, if you like, being elsewhere in the universe. Interestingly, Wells was a Marxist. And do you know who his mentor was at university? Thomas H. Huxley. Anyone recognise that name? He's affectionately known as Darwin's bulldog. That's right. And so he wrote science fiction with this evolutionary worldview in his mind. He already had established that. So let me show you here. This was, when did I do this? September 2002. 12 out of the 15 highest grossing movies of all time are science fiction or fantasy driven with evolutionary themes. And it's been consistently like that. It's about 75% consistently are evolutionary based. And so what happens is we're growing up in a culture where these beliefs are really embedding themselves in the mindset of the population. Second part, conditions must be just right on other planets. Well, let's have a look. Who remembers these photos? Appeared on the front pages of newspapers all over the world in 1996. This is supposed to be a sign of, a face on Mars constructed by an ancient civilization. This city here is called Cydonia. It's supposed to be the ruins of a city. And in fact, when last year NASA sent, I think it was Spirit and Opportunity on their way to Mars, and Beagle 2 arrived Christmas Day. Well, actually, it's arrived somewhere. They can't find it. They were shows on TV. They're very excited about what they'll find on Mars because they're going to be drilling into the surface, collecting rock samples, etc. And I remember watching one show from an Australian astronomer, and he was saying, well, we are Martians after all. We're Martians. So the beliefs have been carried that far, that spores from Mars arrived here and, again, seeded life on Earth. But that was in 1996. In 1998, NASA's global surveyor deliberately circuited this area to take photos again, and you can see it was nothing of the sort. But you never let the facts get in the way of a good story. A guy called Richard Hoagland, who back in 1996 really took up this cause and was propagated as an expert on the issue, even though it's been severely debunked. His website is extremely popular because he's got all these ancient astronaut theories that go along with it. And you might remember this little fella, the Martian rock. And it's a potato-sized rock that was supposed to be ejected from the Martian atmosphere by a volcano, found in the Antarctic ice. And the reason they thought it was a Martian rock was because of this so-called microbial fossil bacteria here. Now you need to understand this is actually smaller than any sort of life or bacteria that we know now. And scientists were actually not very unanimous in the conclusion that it came from Mars. They were greatly divided, and pretty much now it's regarded as a bit of a dud. But one of the reasons they thought it came from Mars is it contained hydrocarbons, compounds that are found on asteroids and in the Martian terrain, and but those hydrocarbons are actually very similar to soot or diesel exhaust, which is also found on Earth. And they actually had the rock for a long, long time, but they only released it, the news, in 1996. And excitedly, Bill Clinton said, if this discovery is confirmed, it would be surely one of the most stunning insights into our universe that science has discovered. Wow. What did they find? A little bit of fossil bacteria of a dubious origin. I think even Dan Golden from NASA was a bit embarrassed, and he said, I want everyone to understand we're not talking about little green men here. And Colin Pillinger, lead scientist of the ill-fated Beagle 2 expedition, he said this doesn't actually prove that the evidence in the meteorite is for life on Mars. But you know, folks, one of the most amazing things I can remember in 1996, and I can remember specifically virtually every single church I visited asked me, and people were very, very concerned about the potential finding for life on Mars. But even if they did find that sort of life on Mars, who's to say it might not have come from the Earth anyway? I mean, if they think it can come from Mars to the Earth, why couldn't it come from the Earth back to Mars? So I wouldn't be too upset about it. Interestingly, it was also announced, the announcement was made around about the same time as a very famous movie of the time that broke all box office records right around the world called Independence Day. So who says that NASA are not clever when it comes to using the media? A bit more on that, if you've got Creation magazine, in fact, they found that a rock from an from a New Zealand volcano, it's in an Auckland museum. They knew the blast date in the 19th century. It was found over 160 kilometres away, and it's got the same evidence of crystals as the supposed Martian rock. So it looks like the rapid cooling of hot lava produces rock with the same evidence of life crystals as the Mars rock. So it's looking even more unlikely that that rock has any extraterrestrial origin at all. But that, to date, is the very best evidence they have for any extraterrestrial life whatsoever. And if you've got Creation magazine, you know. Well, they're very excited about finding water on Mars, and depending how you pronounce it, but this is the Valles Marineris. You could fit the Grand Canyon in there several times over. I remember when drawing that photo off the NASA website, one of the arguments they had there, because they looked at all the sedimentary layering, that means it could have been laid down by, maybe pyroclastic flows or water or moving fluids or something like that. So they're very excited because they think, well, this could have been formed in some sort of rapid catastrophic event on Mars. And in 1903, an astronomer named Percival Lowell believed, looking at a network of canals on Mars, that they were constructed by ancient civilizations. Even in the early 1900s, scientists were meeting together, not because they believed, or not because they were even questioning that was life on Mars. They were actually already presuming to believe that was life on Mars as a result of those canals. And the same today. That's why they're looking for water there. It looks like Mars has been covered with water. And it's very interesting. Robert Boyd wrote in the Cincinnati Enquirer, a flood of biblical proportions, enough to fill the Mediterranean Sea, gushed down from the highlands of Mars 1 billion or so years ago. The latest pictures from Pathfinder confirmed yesterday. Do you like that language? So I'd ask, how is it on the basis of canyons on Mars where there's no known free water? They propose there was once a global flood there, but at the same time deny there was ever a flood on Earth, which has abundant evidence for such a flood and plenty of water. You raise the valleys, lower the mountains, you cover the Earth up to a depth of nearly 3 kilometres. There's plenty of water here. Could there be a global flood on Earth? Absolutely not, they believe. Why? The scriptures give us the answer. See, it's interpretation of the evidence. 2 Peter 3:5 says, but they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. We shouldn't be surprised if we find water elsewhere in the universe. There's water in perhaps some of the moons around Jupiter, and maybe even on Mars. I think, in fact, they probably will find water there. But life doesn't spontaneously arise from water anyway, does it? It's much more complex than that, as we've already seen. So what about outside our solar system? Because there are these things called extrasolar planets. Have you heard of those? And again, Christians are very worried when they heard about the first extrasolar planet. That's a planet outside of our solar system. Well, the thing we need to remember with these extrasolar planets, they're not actually directly seen. And what I mean by that, they don't look through a telescope and look at a solid body of an object there orbiting some other sun or star. And the way that they're determined is by observing the gravitational wobble of nearby stars. By the way, that's an artist representation there. It's not anything real, but just to give you some idea. For example, if we could not see Jupiter from the Earth, we would know mathematically that it would be there because the gravity of Jupiter, being so large, causes a slight off-center wobble of our own sun. So that's how they determine them. Now, the ones they've found so far, many of them are too close to their sun to support life, maybe something similar to that. So it'd just be too hot, be like living on something worse than Venus. planets are the wrong size, there's too much gravity. I mean, Jupiter is an enormous planet. Gravity is multiplied several times over. If you try to stand on the surface, you'd probably be a blob being squashed down, something like that. Most of them are wrong compositions. Jupiter is a gas giant, for example. Now, some of these planets they've seen are 200 times the size of Jupiter. So they're much too large, gas giants. A lot of them have elliptical orbits. They can determine that as it gets nearer, it causes a different wobble in the sun. So you get extreme ranges in temperature as it spheres out and then comes back in. And one conclusion is that many people have reached is they're not planets at all, that they are small brown dwarfs that are small suns or small stars, even smaller than our own sun, for example. So there's no direct evidence that extrasolar planets exist. And you know, when we look out there, it looks like the universe has been specifically designed for life on Earth. That's a principle known as the anthropic principle. I won't go into it now. But how about these scriptures? In Job 26:7, you know, Job, he didn't have the benefit of a space shuttle go out, and he wrote, "He hangs the earth on nothing," talking about God. How did Job know something like that? I mean, he had the law of gravity to contend with, didn't he? I mean, if he wanted to suspend anything, he had to hang it on something. But he wrote that scripture faithfully down under the divine inspiration of God. And in talking about the shape of the earth, even more amazing, he writes, talking about God, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. And that word circle actually is the Hebrew word khug, K-H-U-G, which correctly means sphere. Wow. Isn't that incredible? Great sorts of evidences you can use talking to people when they doubt the Bible. And you know, is it any surprise that we're talking about UFO activity and all of this type of stuff, that the earth is the only place we see it? There's good reason to believe now, as we heard with John Hartnett's talk, that the earth is actually the physical centre of the universe. But you know what it definitely is? It's definitely the spiritual centre of the universe. And is that just a coincidence why we see this activity on the earth? In fact, the Bible says why God created the earth specifically. God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. Wow, God made this earth, perhaps this universe for us. That is pretty awesome, isn't it? And in fact, when we look out here, what I like to call the awe factor, because people say, well, you know, why did God make it so big? Well, I'd reason with you that if he made it a bit smaller, people would probably say, well, he's not that great anyway, is he? Maybe he's not so omnipotent. But they wonder why he made it so big, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the one thing we must remember, the scriptures say that the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or weary. It's not hard for him. In fact, John Whitcomb, who wrote this little book here, The Bible and Astronomy, which is available up the back there, great little book, he actually said it must be remembered that it required no more exertion for God to create 1 billion galaxies than one planet. I want you to think about that. We've talked about DNA. In fact, it takes a lot more creative input, intelligence, and energy to create the DNA of a dead fish and multiply it to feed 5,000 people than it does to create 1 billion galaxies. Because stars and galaxies are mainly composed of hot gas. That's what they are. And you know what? When you want to know about the stars, why did he create so many? Well, it's not too hard. The Bible says he determines the number of stars and he calls them each by name. God knows the name of every single star, every one of those billions and billions and billions of them. The next question. Now we're getting down to the juicy stuff. Aliens must be able to travel vast distances. Well, anyone heard of Billy Meier before? No? Well, Billy Meier was one of the famous contactees of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He claimed 3 alien visitors were coming to him, giving him messages. He's basically uncovered, supposedly, texts that were missing from the New Testament. This is often what happens, stories like this. And he said, no one will believe me, no one will believe me. So apparently his ET visitors said, well, we'll do a few laps around the blocks for you, and we'll give you the opportunity to get some video footage. And he's got thousands of feet of video film. And he had thousands and thousands of people flocking to his cult in Switzerland, which is still there today. And the people who've spoken out against him have received death threats and all sorts of stuff, so please pray for me. But in fact, skeptics sent an undercover group in there to penetrate the cult, and very sloppily they went into a shed out the back and they found all these spaceships. They were pie plates and ping pong balls and this sort of stuff, but nonetheless, people fell for it. And their whole eternal destiny has been, basically vanquished on the basis of believing this lie. And even worse was to come for Billy when his wife Poppy divorced him and spilled the beans on him to the worldwide press as well. Nothing like a woman's scorn, they say. Here's my favourite, the Next Generation Star Trek craft. But here we go. They've got to travel at warp speed. Warp is faster than light. Light speed is 300,000 kilometres per second, right? You've got to travel much faster than that to get around the universe. In fact, if Einstein's right, it would actually be impossible to travel even at light speed. Now, just think about what I'm going to say for a minute, because it's a bit mind-bending. Because to travel at light speed, you require your mass becomes infinite, and you require an infinite amount of energy. You'd have to have all the available energy in the universe at your disposal to travel at light speed. Sounds freaky, but that's basically the problem. So they come up with ideas of warp space. They create bubbles in the space-time continuum and travel on those, and science fiction to the rescue. See, when they create that and you travel faster than warp, then you've got the trouble of all the occupants getting splattered on the walls and when they accelerate and all this type of stuff. But science fiction to the rescue again, you create inertial dampeners. Heard those? Etc. But it's estimated that there's 100,000 dust particles per cubic kilometre of space. And that an impact with one of those at light speed, or even, let's say, even 1/10 light speed, would be the equivalent of several tons of TNT going off in the spaceship. So then you've got to have machines and technology to be available to detect specks of dust in front of you, and so the whole thing really becomes impossible. At light speed, a speck of dust would obliterate a spaceship. Now here's a really powerful spacecraft. This is the Space Shuttle. Requires enormous amounts of energy. It's a very, very heavy vehicle because it's reusable, unlike the little capsules they used to send off in the early Gemini and Apollo missions. Have a look at this. It generates 3.3 million kilos of thrust in 2 minutes. Just the solid rocket boosters, just these two, not even the main engines. Okay, they could supply the total power demand of 87,000 homes for a full day in just 2 minutes. Anybody here own a V8? A few. You think that's thirsty? This baby can empty your swimming pool in 25 minutes. Fuel, if it was full of fuel. Sorry, did I say 25 minutes? In 25 seconds, I beg your pardon. 25 seconds. I'd like to see the carburetor. Probably it's got fuel injection. That's okay. Now, who remembers this? These city-sized craft in Independence Day. Now, can you imagine the energy requirements to propel something like this? So people get it wrong. They think space is full of nothing, so it's easy to propel something. But in fact, I could stand in space and throw a ball, and I could propel the ball. But if I wanted to try and push, say, a 1-ton block, as I pushed it, I would be propelled backwards. In fact, to try to get a 1-pound ball, 500-gram ball or whatever it is, to light speed, it would require the energy of 20 hydrogen bombs just to speed it up. Then you need the same amount of energy to slow it down again, and then to speed it back up to the return trip, and then slow it down again. So something city-shaped, even using antimatter drives or whatever, no chance. Now, the fastest vehicle we've ever had were the Apollo missions. The Saturn V rockets launched the Apollo craft, and at the speed of the Apollo craft, it would take 870,000 years to reach the next nearest star to our own Earth. 870,000 years. That's Proxima Centauri. So you can see it really is in the realm of science fiction to presume that there are technologies capable of doing this and defying the laws of physics to get here. Now, crop circles, one of the most asked questions I get. Who's seen this movie, by the way, Signs? Put your hands up. That was scary, wasn't it? I went with one of our teammates, Brendan, and his wife buried her head under his arms. Never forget that. But actually, shame on you, you shouldn't be watching this sort of stuff because it is pretty bad. I need to watch it for research purposes, of course. But have a look at some of these shapes they've seen around the world. All sorts of complex designs. These first appeared in the late 60s, I think early 70s in the south of England. And they were a pretty simple design, and then they got more and more complex. Now, some of the hyperbole that's followed these, and you've heard some of this stuff, they are so precise and so exact, they could not have been man-made. The stalks have been bent in such a fashion. They've not been broken. We don't know any technology that can do that. There's leftover radiation. The cellular structure of the corn stalks or the wheat stalks or whatever it is have been changed. We've heard stories like that. But I'm going to show you now irrefutable evidence of the power behind crop circles. Are you ready for this? Here we go. Folks, it's man-made. This was built in 16 hours, by humans that is. Yes, I did mean that. Okay, made by a group called Circle Makers, and they actually do this for money. But they also have a bit of fun. They actually regard it as artwork, so they do creep into farms in the middle of the night and see what they can get away with. But in the 1980s, two elderly gentlemen by the name of Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley stepped forward and claimed responsibility for all the crop circles that appeared, in that early period. Now, they multiplied all over the world, so the first thing you need to realise, even though there are experts called seriologists, okay, serious field studies in this, that say they're created by aliens, just average Joe Blows like you or me gathered that it could be made, and they started replicating it all around the world. And Doug and Dave, when they came out and took credit for them, they were debunked. They were regarded as hoaxes. So what happened, the BBC got together with Doug and Dave, now in their 70s, and under the cover of darkness, they created a very, very complex crop circle in a field. They didn't tell the experts about it. No one knew. They got no assistance, but the BBC filmed them. And they got a couple of experts in by the name of Colin Andrews and Patrick Delgado, world's foremost seriologists. They said, wow, here's another crop circle. And they brought them in the next day and they said, yep, these are definitely of extraterrestrial origin. So there you go. But they're pretty clever, these guys. Extraterrestrials look like us. Can you see that? There we go. That's a postcard of Mum and Dad from Pleiades. And Doug and Dave, realising that everybody else in the world had cottoned onto the idea, thought we'll have a bit of fun, and they created a crop circle with the words inside, we are not alone. There's more, because even the ex-seriologists thought that was a real message by the ETs, but they never stopped to think if it was actually aliens that did it, they would have said, you are not alone. So there we go. Here's how they make them. You can go to this website, circlemakers.org, and that's how they make them. Look at this, folks, a plank and 2 bits of rope. That is the most common and effective method used by people all over the world in making crop circles. However, there is a sinister side to it. And the circle makers, and again, look for yourself, you go to their website, their name originally was Team Satan. And you would wonder why somebody would call themselves Team Satan. I mean, they're in this for business now. Obviously, it was politically incorrect and they changed it. But why would a group of people call themselves Team Satan? Well, when you investigate their website, you'll see that they say when they build these crop circles, they have all sorts of paranormal experiences. People have had healings. There's been radio interruptions. Lights have appeared in the sky. People have suffered nausea, all sorts of weird stuff. And so they don't believe that it's UFOs, they just think it is some sort of psychic or paranormal experience. And in fact, that's the same occurrence that many other people who've built these around the world have also claimed when they built them. And I think that's probably one of the ideas that I'm formulating as to why we're starting to see an increase in this phenomenon in the world, because people are dabbling in areas. I mean, for example, I was in Canada recently, I turned on the Sci-Fi channel and there was a woman channeling a message from an alien being. And she was saying from this alien being that we've evolved to such a state that you couldn't see me. My atoms move so fast that if you were to pass your hand through my body, if you were to try to touch me, your hand would pass right through my body. And so people are dabbling in some sort of what they think is some sort of pseudo-technology when it's really opening a doorway to the occult. And we're inviting, or they are inviting these things in, and we're starting to see an increase of them. Remember stories like the Nazca lines of Peru in Erich von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods? We had these lines there. Some of these are wide. Some of them, like this one here, are only a few inches wide. They only have about an inch of rainfall on the Nazca Plains, so they've remained there. And Erich von Daniken, he presumed that these were extraterrestrial landing strips. And it is just quite simply, I mean, work it out. I mean, they fly billions of light years across the universe to get here and need a few landing strips in some plains in Peru to get their way around the Earth. I mean, but that's actually known as the Nazca spaceport in ufology. And it's quite simply, all they were built by the Peruvian Indians of the day in some sort of ceremonial worship. I mean, the Mayans, for example, were extremely good astronomers. He says, no way could man have made that, because you've really got to go to the air to appreciate the full beauty and design of what they've done. That was his excuse, is to say, hey, there's been extraterrestrial interference in the past. But what about this one? Now, this is the world's largest piece of art out near Mundy Plains in Broken Hill. An artist by the name of Peter Anderson, for 12 months, he didn't tell anybody, not using GPS or anything like that, only a tractor and a mower, and obviously plotted it out, but he created this undetected. To give you some idea of the size, the mouth there is as big as an Australian rules football field. That's how big it is. 4 million square metres. One man. What could ancient Peruvian Indians have created with perhaps 1,000 of workers, you know, under their leader or whatever? So you see, these sorts of things are quite easy to debunk, but they take on a life of their own. And the reason is because people want to believe. People are looking for salvation from the stars. They're looking in the wrong places. They're looking for some technology to come and save us from all of our problems, to bring a different life on the earth. Here we go. The Roswell incident. Well, what happened? Well, that was what appeared in the newspaper the day after. There was an incident in Roswell. In case you don't know what it is, New Mexico, 1947. Supposedly a flying saucer crashed. They took bodies of aliens and hid them in Area 51 or something like that. And the next day, though, or a few days later, it was actually debunked, but no one ever shows you that headline. Here's Captain Jesse Marcel, foremost promulgator of the idea of saying that this was a flying saucer, and he definitely saw the wreckage and the bodies. But sadly, Jesse hasn't fared too well. Before he died, they found that he even frauded his own military record to establish himself in the public eye, etc. But the most disturbing things was this alien autopsy movie. Remember seeing that, folks? In Brisbane, it was aired twice in 3 weeks by the Fox network. And I have to say, you've got to understand how powerful this is. Even as a Christian working in full-time ministry, I watched this stuff. It was being paraded as real. We really recovered these bodies. We really did autopsies on them. They were saying that the film was genuine because they sent it to Kodak and it was verified as a 1940s piece of film. But you know, I did a bit more research and I found out that Kodak, there was more to it. They said, yes, it was 1940-odd film, but there was no footage of it. We only got a piece of the leader tape. Okay? So, what was going on? That's what you want to know. But let me go back. The alien autopsy, I was sitting there thinking, this is really powerful stuff. And I had to take stock and say, hang on, the Bible is true, there is an answer to this. And that's some of the evidence that I uncovered. And also one of the actors has come forward and blown the whistle on them as well. So again, why did they do it? For money. It was very, very popular, appeared all around the world. What happened? Well, it was secret government technology. It was a project called Project Mogul. And what it was were an array of weather balloons that were tied together to reach right up into the stratosphere. And the jet streams can carry them, and they can move them fast, stop them, change directions. And underneath the balloons was a little box of balsa wood sticks covered with foil with acoustic listening devices. Now, you need to remember, this is long before there were satellites. America had the bomb. They'd used it. And they wanted to know what the Soviet Union was doing. And their only way of listening to above-ground nuclear tests was what we would regard today this primitive form of technology. Why was it top secret? Well, you can imagine they didn't want the Soviets to know what they were doing. Even the American Air Force didn't know what was going on. It was that top secret at the time. So there we go. That's what Roswell was all about. And in fact, I'd heard stories in the Roswell incident book that there were alien hieroglyphics that they'd found. And you know, you can search this out for yourself on the skeptics' websites or something like that. But this is how ridiculous it gets. The silver foil that was taped to the balsa wood sticks was actually Scotch tape from a toy company, and it had flower symbols and all sorts of toy-like designs, and that was regarded as alien hieroglyphics. So there you go. UFOs must be real alien visitations. Well, here's a picture of a UFO. This is very common. Lights in the sky. You can even see a trail. They don't make any noise. In fact, as research in my book, I've been able to find people who saw these things before they became Christians. This one was never explained. 1957 by Ella Louise Fortune. No answer for that one. They defy physics. They do U-turns at impossible speeds. But 90% of them turn out to be humbug. That is, they're explainable, man-made or natural phenomena. In fact, the most common mistaken sighting is the planet Venus, accounts for over 30% of all sightings. See, so sometimes it's satellites or whatever. But research has shown, and this is a sociologist, Erdling, he wrote in Focus magazine, research has shown that people who are not affiliated with any church but who claim they are religious are particularly susceptible to the possible existence of extraterrestrials. For them, ufology is a substitute religion. And you know, one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world today are the UFO cults. And you've heard of the Raelians, of course. You would understand that. Talk a bit more about them in a minute. But this guy's right. He's a skeptic, no friend of ours, but he says the only reason anyone takes the abductees seriously today is because their delusions do not blatantly conflict with our cultural beliefs that intergalactic space travel is a real possibility, and that it is highly probable that we are not the only inhabited planet in the universe. Science fiction and evolution. In other times, no one else would have been able to take these claims seriously. However, though, there's more to it than that, because these UFO sightings have not just been occurring, although there's an explosion in the last 50 years, they've been occurring for as long as we have written records or even oral records in ancient civilizations. American Indians saw flying canoes with people in them. Romans and Greeks saw flying shields with people in them. In the late 1800s, there was an airship wave in the 1896 and 1898 in America that resembled they were sort of forerunners, if you like, of the airships that were to come recently. That is very interesting. John Keel, he's a guy that wrote The Mothman Prophecies, a movie with Richard Gere, very, very cogent researcher and quite a good guy. He says the UFOs do not seem to exist as tangible, manufactured objects. They do not conform to the natural laws of our environment. They seem to be nothing more than transmogrifications tailoring themselves to our abilities to understand. The thousands of contacts with the entities indicate that they are liars and put-on artists. The UFO manifestations seem to be, by and large, merely minor variations of the old age demonological phenomenon. It's the same old stuff dressed up in the emperor's new clothes. And you've heard of Rael. I was at a UFO conference. These guys had their tables there with their books. I walked up to two blokes there, had a chat with them, and said, Rael must be very happy with all the advertising. I read that he said he reckoned he'd got about $500 million worth of advertising as a result of the cloning issue. Remember the child that they believe they cloned? Made press all over the world? He said, yes, we're very, very happy. We have many people coming to us. And I called him Rael, and I was corrected in my terminology. It's just one thing. We don't call him Rael. He is the Messiah. That's what I was corrected on. And so they believe that extraterrestrials called the Elohim visited the earth about 55,000 years ago and created life on earth. See, why is it alluring? Why is it always the Bible? Because most people know a bit of the Bible. Generally, you don't find the ETs giving us messages, ETs in inverted commas, giving us messages about the Quran or other ancient writings. There are stories of demon sort of stories or UFO type sightings, as Keel said in other literature. But none of them are sort of reinterpreted like the Bible is to incorporate this idea of extraterrestrials visiting the Earth. These are pictures by a lady that I'm just communicating with at the moment. She claims to be a Christian. She's met Jesus on the spaceship. She was first abducted at age 7, etc. You might snigger. It is very, even though I'm involved in this research, it is the most difficult thing to talk to her, because she is having, or believes that she's having, real experiences. She believes that she's meeting a divine being. We even had a lady ring the office last year, frustrated, a Christian woman whose daughter believes that she'd been abducted by aliens. Fortunately, my wife, who's the first proofreader for my book, answered the phone. I was able to go out and see her, and she didn't give me much information on the phone, and I said, well, if I may, I said, with your daughter, I said, there's either stuff going on that you don't know about or she's not telling you. She said, what do you mean? And I listed off, and some of it's graphic, I listed off a list of things that are happening. I said, if what's happening to your daughter is the same as other people around the world, this is what I believe. And I listed them off, and she was absolutely staggered. And she suddenly realized that her daughter was not a kook, even though she may be tendencing that way, but there was some real phenomenon happening to her. And you can see how it's reinterpreted. Here's the UFO parting the Red Sea. Here's Elijah being raptured into a spaceship. I have pictures more disturbing than that of Jesus on a cross with thousands of flying saucers hovering over him, being the heavenly host, supposedly. But you know, the Bible warns us. Have a think about this scripture. You may have read it. Never realize the significance. Paul writes, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let him be eternally condemned. Always centered on the Bible, these contacts. Long before there was science fiction and UFOs, a man named Joseph Smith had a visitor. And Joseph Smith came away with another book, which is now the Book of Mormon. Muhammad was in a cave for 6 months, receiving a visit, so-called, supposedly from the angel Gabriel. And after all that teaching, his collections of writings on parchments and all sorts of stuff were collected into the book of the Quran. Same old stuff. And the Bible warns us, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them, that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. For this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, they should believe a lie. So just recapping, if life evolved on the earth, it must have happened elsewhere in this enormous universe. Well, life cannot form spontaneously. We know that on the earth, it won't form spontaneously everywhere else. Aliens did not create life on earth. If they did, who created them? And then who were their creators, and so on? All they're doing is pushing the problem into outer space where it can't be tested. Conditions must be right on other planets. Well, we've never observed another planet capable of sustaining life. Aliens must be able to travel vast distances. Impossible. UFO sightings must be real alien visitations. Never a single contact with a real ET. No fragment, no piece. If all of these millions of people have really been into alien spaceships, how come they don't bring back a cigarette lighter or something like that? Never once. But you know, the Bible explains this, because we can find out the origin of these visitors from the Bible. We can also find out the future, because many of these future visits, they're very prophetic, these aliens. They're telling us about all sorts of mass evacuations on the earth and all sorts of trouble that closely parallel the biblical texts. It's very interesting. It warns us. And I started to have a different look at this scripture. I'm not saying it applies to this. It may apply to many things, but who knows? For there shall arise false Christs, false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive, if it were possible, the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. You know, you can even look in the book of Jeremiah, and God warns Jeremiah not to be frightened of the nations and the signs in the sky. He tells them. Well, we're going to go on a journey. Let's give some glory to God in all of this. You needn't worry, because God is in control of the universe. And this is nothing more than a spiritual battle. And because of our cultural beliefs, that is why it is accelerating today. I want you to comprehend the size of the universe. We've all been a bit spun out this week. But if you could travel at light speed, all right, that's 300,000 kilometres every second, you would go around the Earth 7 times in 1 second. You'd pass the Moon in 2 seconds. Mars in 4 minutes, Pluto in 5 hours. And it would take 4.3 years to reach the next star in our own galaxy, the Milky Way. And then the next nearest star in our own Milky Way would take you 2 million years. And then the next galaxy would take you 20 million years once you left the Milky Way. And do you know what, folks? You haven't even begun to travel the universe. You've just started. Scratch the scratch on the scratch. But in all of this awesome universe, I'd like you to consider this. Here we have a picture of all the galaxies containing billions of stars, and maybe one like our Milky Way, and here we are somewhere in the outer third. Here's our sun. What an awesome God we have. Jesus said, even the hairs on our head have been counted, and it's not too hard for God. Folks, I need to answer this question for you, because if I don't, everyone will ask me. In Romans 8:22, it tells us that the whole of creation groans and travails. That's not just the earth, that's the entire universe as well. The whole of creation under the weight of sin because of the curse, right up to the present time. It would not make sense for God to create intelligent beings on other planets who've been affected by Adam and Eve's sin, through no fault of their own. So poor old Spock out there on planet Vulcan has been subjected to the curse. And what gets worse is that he's going to be destroyed when God creates a new heavens and a new earth. When Jesus came to redeem us, the ones he loved, the ones he created this magnificent universe for, besides himself, he came to this earth and he came as a man. And the redeemed church, or his bride, will be with him throughout eternity. Jesus is not going to go to other planets and die again and again and again and again, because the Bible says he died once for all. That's how I know. Now, some of you might say, hey Gary, the Bible does not specifically say God did not create life elsewhere, but you can deduce that he didn't by implication. In the big picture, starting right at creation, a fall, etc. And why so big? Well, it gets even more awesome. The purpose of stars. God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Goes on. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, all the flocks and the herds, the beasts of the fields, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, all that swim in the paths of the sea. O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. He made all of this for us. And this is one of the most downloaded photos ever from the NASA website. It's about 7,000 light years from Earth, and it's about a light year long. That's 9.6 trillion kilometres. God is everywhere at the same time. And when we look at him, when we look up, that's what we should be reminded of, the creator of the universe. Not that there might be other life, alien life out there. Okay, thank you.